So welcome to part 4 of our course. This material covers our study of the way that arguments and reasoning can go wrong. So we'll be looking at common patterns of failure in reasoning and inquiry. So the most familiar kinds of failures, we call these fallacies. So originally the word fallacy in English was associated with trickery or deception. And some of this original sense of the word fallacy persists in its modern usage. So we say that a fallacious argument is one that's liable to convince a reader or a listener to believe something for bad reasons. And nowadays the term fallacy is used as a kind of general catch-all for label for failed arguments. However, the kinds of failures that we philosophers have in mind are failures to follow some basic normative principles of reasoning. When we say that fallacies are cases where we fail to follow good argumentative practices, notice that these kinds of failures can actually be compatible with successfully persuading your audience. So fallacious arguments are often remarkably effective ways of persuading people to accept some belief. So politicians and advertisers often use fallacies or false claims in situations where it would be more difficult, perhaps, to convince their audience using rational arguments or true claims. So while a fallacy might be rhetorically successful for certain purposes, for the purposes of becoming better thinkers, we're going to consider all violations of basic norms of rationality to be failures. So this part of your course will help you to understand and identify fallacies with the hope that you can avoid being manipulated by them. Now, there are, in fact, an infinite number of ways that arguments can fail. And in this part of the course, we'll only examine some of the most common forms of fallacies. And understanding the principal kinds of fallacies that afflict our reasoning should make us more careful thinkers and should help us to avoid decisions based on faulty reasoning. So as we'll see, fallacies fall into two major types. So there's the formal fallacies and the informal fallacies. Formal fallacies are those arguments that fail by virtue of their form. And these are the easiest, it turns out, to detect once we have a little bit of training in logic, some basic logic, and some understanding of probability and statistics also. So in cases where the arguments go wrong for purely formal reasons, we simply need to recognize some bad argument as an instance of an illegitimate pattern of reasoning. And if we recognize that an argument is formally fallacious, we must reject it. So notice that we must reject formally fallacious arguments even in cases where we lack the ability to judge the content of the argument. So even if you're not an expert on, for example, climate science or French literature or entomology, you'll be in a position to reject formally fallacious arguments in those fields. Now the second type, the informal fallacies, require a little bit more subtlety. So many of the arguments aren't formal fallacies, and yet they're still fallacious, we say. So we call informal fallacies fallacies because they're illegitimate impediments to excellence in inquiry, excellence in reasoning, or decision making. So informal fallacies convince their audience by means of trickery or emotion or distraction, etc. And they can exploit our limited ability to pay attention, or they can prevent us from reaching conclusions in the best ways possible, just generally speaking. So we'll give lots of attention to the informal fallacies in this part of our course.